Hey friends. I got a couple things kind of percolating today, so to speak. And maybe they'll end up combining or somehow being related, but there's something that showed up this morning that so I'm sitting in meditation, and there was a sense of like that thing that happens when when stillness is there, is available, right? And we can kind of sense it within us. We can sense, oh, I have access to this stillness, but it's also kind of elusive, or our mind keeps sort of driving the show a little bit. I guess what my sensation was a little bit this morning, that I was a little more, it's funny how this works. I did a post just a couple days ago where it felt like stillness was just right there, and all I had to do was drop down into it. I could just kind of like at will dive into the ocean. This morning it was a little more like I could dive into the ocean, but I had to kind of really focus on the ocean, or else the mind just kind of grabbed me again. And so something flashed for me as I was having that experience and just kind of sitting with that experience, because I was also listening to Sadhguru's book recently, and he says this thing. He talks about religious belief, and he talks about the idea of heaven, and basically, and it's kind of a contrast between the approach that he's sort of talking about, which is basically to take responsibility for all of our own karma, versus a way of engaging with spirituality that sort of defers responsibility, and that puts our hopes on something like the concept of heaven. And he says the concept of heaven is one of the most pernicious beliefs, because it posits that life happens at its best elsewhere. And I was like, wow, that's a huge statement. And it so clearly illustrates the psychological effects of believing in something like heaven, or of having an attachment to the idea that there's a place and a time in our realm where all of our problems just go away, and we're just in a state of bliss always, as though that place is not where we are now and every moment of the universe, right? Because if it's somewhere else, then not dealing with our karma right now is kind of fine, because we're going to go to heaven anyway eventually. Whereas if that concept is either not on the table, or if it's really understood that that realm, that heavenly realm, is a metaphor for the domain of existence that's always available to us here, right now, in every moment, in every actual moment, then our karma, or our mind, or our mind, which is a part of our karma, those barriers to the experience of perpetual bliss become the things we need to engage with in order to connect with the domain that is there all the time. And I noticed this thing happening in my mind where it's kind of like my preference for distraction. This happens to me sometimes in meditation, and maybe you've had this experience where you're meditating, and we know that there are these, as you start to meditate, you really start to get a sense of of these different parts of ourselves. Some days it's just like I'm just lying in a pool of oceanic bliss. And I'm just totally there. Nothing to do. I'm just there. Other days, I'm bouncing around. I'm thinking about this. I'm worried about that. I'm wondering if I took care of my mind is going a mile a minute. And there are days when that experience of the mind kind of running the show, being the thing that for whatever reason today I find more compelling than all of the bliss in the universe. There are times when I actually internally I feel a preference for that distraction. It's like I prefer the distraction. And that, to me, that preference for distraction, which is a little bit what I was feeling this morning, is kind of the same thing as supposing that heaven is somewhere else, right? Because it's kind of like saying the actual domain of spiritual infinity, source, consciousness that we literally can't lose access to, and that we are composed of, but that for whatever reason right now we've identified with with a limited aspect of our ego, and so we're not in touch with that dimension. We're kind of saying that dimension isn't really worth the work. I know I could feel infinite bliss, but I'm just kind of not feeling that today. I really want to go shop on Amazon or whatever. And there's something about when, as I was kind of wrestling with this experience this morning, that kind of felt like it was related to this idea that heaven is somewhere else, because it's almost like if I'm allowed to, if it is, and obviously it's not a conscious belief. I don't consciously believe that I'm going to go to a realm where all of this just goes away and my karma magically dissolves and I'm just, I'm made perfect in an instant. That's not what I believe happens spiritually. I believe we are in a process of active evolution that essentially goes on forever. But but that doesn't mean that the pattern of putting the expectation or the notion of blissful existence without responsibility, it doesn't mean that I'm not programmed with that, and that I'm not on some level operating out of those assumptions, even with very conscious beliefs to the contrary. I'm still kind of like my behavior exhibits it. My behavior is exhibiting that pattern, and actually, if I'm watching for it, then my behavior can communicate to me what that pattern is, and I can really see that's the pattern that I'm compulsively living out here. So, as far as what to do about that, I think what I did find, and I find this is basically my kind of summary view of any number of aspects of practice. This comes up in music, this comes up in Qigong, comes up all kinds of different ways. But I think my summary view of what to do in those circumstances is to, because obviously, resisting that, if I'm feeling this preference for distraction, which is kind of a nice way of summarizing it. It's a preference for distraction means I think it means I'm willing to delude myself that perfection might just happen, even if I don't do the work right now. And again, this isn't like my sort of imperative or my my message to myself isn't in those moments. I try not to make it like, oh yeah, I just need to work harder. I just need to be meditating harder. That'll help. You know what I need? I need is a little more pressure on my meditation to make it better. That's not the approach, and that's kind of like the self-judgment around that, or the sort of like the ambition that can encroach on spiritual practice is one of the things, at least for me, again, and I know other people struggle with this too, but I don't know how universal that feeling is, but there's this ambition around spiritual practice that can really kind of take us off course. So, and obviously in a situation like this where we're identifying, oh, I have a preference for distraction, what do I do about that? When I see that, I'm seeing myself drift in a direction, and I know that it's not the direction I really want to go, but at the same time, either some volition within me or some attachment within me or some emotional, needs or wants are drawing me there. How do I deal with that? And the only thing I've come up with is be really gentle and don't try to change it, and see if I can simply sit and observe that. Oh, I have a preference for distraction. Let me just watch that for a couple minutes. Oh, I got distracted from watching it because the distraction got me again. Look, isn't that interesting? Let me watch that. Let me see if I can identify the moment when I go from watching it to being distracted again. Right? That's the best I've got, is like letting myself observe, seeing if I can put one step between myself, my felt sense of self, the locus of my awareness, where my consciousness is sitting, one step between that and the whatever pattern, whatever thing I'm doing, whatever pattern is in the space, whatever pattern is in my body and mind. Because if I can get the tiniest of air gaps in there, the tiniest of distinctions between my identity and what I'm doing, then I have space not to be controlled by it. And it's not easy. That's one that really kind of, especially depending on the day, some days it is easy, but other days, if I'm really kind of in it, if there's really like if my mind really kind of it's really on a tear, it can be quite a heavy lift to keep from getting sucked into that, but it is possible, and it's always worth it. Always worth it. Always worth it to, like when in doubt, observe. I guess is the moral of that story for me. So that's what I've come to today, folks. Thanks for watching. Appreciate you. Love you. Have a wonderful day. I will see you tomorrow.